Boy in Green. Chapter 1. Peter was a short and underrated boy. He lived amongst others around his age, but they were all bigger and taller than him. The only thing he had in common with them was that he never knew his parents. Otherwise, he was different on so many levels. Yes, he was short, but he was also half-elf and half-fairy. And for whatever reason, none of the other boys liked him very much because of it, so Peter kept to himself and dreamed of something bigger. However, dreaming wasn't always good for him. Like at that moment, as he slept, nibs painted over Peter's face. The other boys watched and giggled as Nibs wrote the words "Lost Boy" on Peter's forehead. It was topped off with the glasses and rosy cheeks Nibs had already given him. Suddenly, Sir Don, a tall, dark, and burly man, came into the room and saw what the boys were doing. "Back away from him," he bellowed, waking Peter from his sleep. Peter looked around at everyone, who had backed away from his bed. They held in their laughter as they stared at Peter's baffled face as some of his blonde bangs stuck to the wet paint. Sir Don came towards Peter and sighed. It was the third time this had happened just this week. How was he ever going to present these boys to King Atmos when they acted that way toward poor Peter? "Come with me, Peter," Sir Don said to the boy. Sleepily, Peter got up from his mattress and followed Sir Don out of the room lined with beds. Once the door was closed behind them, they heard the boys choke from held-in laughter. They continued to walk away from the rowdy room. "Do you know what they wrote on you?" Sir Don asked Peter. "No, sir," he responded honestly. "Lost Boy." "Excuse me, sir, but what's wrong with that? It sounds pretty neat." No. I didn't raise you to be clueless. Calling you a lost boy is like saying you're an outcast and that you're completely shunned. That's not a neat thing," Sir Don explained to Peter as they entered the garden room. From there they went to the center fountain adorned with a statue of a fairy. Sir Don had Peter sit down on a wooden box used for storing garden tools, and then he took some water from the fountain and splashed it on Peter's face. After that, he rubbed the paint off with his giant dark hands. "Now, you do realize that today is the day you 12-year-olds are released from my care and into King Atmos's? If you do not show him you can fight well enough against the others, he will likely place you in the stables to muck up Pegasus' dung. It's that or train to become a knight." Peter got off the box and said, "Well, aren't there other options? Like cooking? Those aren't the only two choices." Sir Don studied Peter for a long time, thinking of how he could put it nicely. He gave up and said, "For you, son, it is your only two. We leave in the afternoon. Don't forget." After that, Sir Don left Peter to his own devices. Peter sat back down on the box, wondering if Sir Don's words were truly the case. Peter could either impress the king or fail at it horribly. It seemed like those were always the odds for him. There was no in-between. Peter played with the fountain water, staring at his misshaped reflection. His blue eyes with his pointy ears sticking out of his blonde hair reflected back at him. Nothing identified him as a fairy, but he was still teased about it. What was so wrong that his mother had been a fairy and his father an elf? It was the only information he had of them from Sir Don, otherwise, it was a blank page. That and a green hat that belonged to his father. Finally, Peter took courage, the one thing he was always good at. He got off the box and went to the dorm room to get his father's hat. It was the only possession he was going to take with him to the castle. When he got to the room, all the other boys were at breakfast. Peter walked to his bunk and grabbed the cone-shaped green hat with a red feather and placed it on his head. He didn't care what the other boys would say to him. He would wear it proudly. "You're leaving today?" someone asked behind him, coming into the room. Peter turned and saw it was Michael, one of the younger boys in Sir Don's care. Michael was always following Peter around, him and another boy named John. They were brothers that got sent to Sir Don when their parents died, just like the rest of them. Michael was 2 years younger than Peter and John was 1 year. "That's right," Peter said. Michael nodded. "I hope you become a knight. You deserve it. We've seen you fight, me and John. We think you're really good, and one day, we want to be just like you." This warmed Peter's heart. "Thank you. I hope the best for your brother next year." Then Peter strolled off to get some breakfast. He found Nibs in the courtyard training with Slightly as Peter walked to the dining area. Nibs had a dark complexion and sharp facial features, and he was the only boy Peter truly feared. Slightly, though just as strong and tall as Nibs, was a mere pawn. He did whatever Nibs ordered him to. The boys both gave him grins as he passed by. They were to be his rivals for becoming a knight, only two got to be trained as it was a station that granted the status of nobility. Inside the dining area were the rest of the 12-year-old boys. Toodles helped cook breakfast while Curly secretly added more salt to the meal. And then there were the twins. Peter didn't pay them much attention because every time he tried to figure out who was who, they would confuse him. They also spoke at the same time too. It was like they were the same person anyway. Curly came up to Peter with a plate of oversalted eggs. He gave Peter a big wicked smile. "Want some eggs, Pan? Or do you want Toodles to make a set on you instead of on the frying pan?" Peter took the plate and did not comment on how Curly used his last name as a joke. There was nothing funny about using a person as a pan, even if that was their name. As Peter sat at one of the tables, Curly followed him. The chubby boy leaned on the table, waiting for Peter to try the food. Expecting the eggs to be salty, Peter sucked a mouthful in. Then, without making any kind of silly face, he gulped it down. Curly frowned in disappointment. Peter was the only person he truly wanted to trick, but every time, Peter knew what Curly had done. Only Nibs could pull off a prank on Peter, it seemed. Bored now, Curly left and searched for another victim to pull a prank on. Peter ate the rest of the eggs quickly to avoid getting too much of the taste. Once he was done, he took the plate over to the twins. They grabbed it from him. One washed it, then the other dried. Peter did have to give them one thing: they know how to make anything look fun, even washing the dishes. He wasn't going to say that aloud though, because then he would end up getting the job. That's what happened last time, not that it would matter once it was the afternoon. They would be on their way to the castle by then. Slowly, Peter made his way to the courtyard where Nibs and Slightly still trained. He didn't bother with them. They never let him train with them unless it was to have a reason to beat him up, so he got one of the wooden swords and went to a tree. From there, he practiced his swordsmanship. He stabbed, swiped left, then right, and then did a spin. From the corner of Peter's eye, he saw John staring at him with odd eyes. Then there was a shout at Peter. He turned around in time to block a blow from Slightly. Slightly was the most aggressive and arrogant boy in the group, but that meant he didn't use his head half of the time. Slightly took a step back and tried to swing at Peter's legs. On instinct, Peter jumped back, then rolled in on Slightly, getting his legs. Slightly dropped his sword and hopped on one leg as he held the other. Nibs then stepped in for Slightly. Never had Peter beaten Nibs. It was going to be a challenge for Peter, but he wanted to end it before anything serious happened. Peter didn't like looking for fights unless it was called for. Twisting his wooden sword, Nibs charged at Peter. Peter ducked as the sword swung past his head. Then Peter tried getting in closer as he did with Slightly. Instead of hitting Nibs' legs, his sword cracked under Nibs' foot. After that, Nibs punched Peter in the face. It wasn't anything new as Sir Don showed up at that moment, yelling at Nibs and Slightly. Sir Don helped Peter to his feet. He looked over at Nibs and Slightly with distaste. If you are to become knights, you will have to work with one another, not gang up on each other. Now all of you, we're heading out early. Follow me. All 7 of the 12-year-old boys followed Sir Don out of the courtyard and to a group of Pegasuses. Those who were fairies, namely the twins and Toodles, revealed their wings. The twins both had blue jay wings, signaling they were animal fairies. Toodles' wings were a generic shape and were a transparent green, making him a day fairy, or in other words, a fairy with no specialized gifts. The rest of the boys were elves and hopped on the Pegasuses with Sir Don. Peter joined them and took a brown Pegasus. He knew this one well because he always fed her when he did stable work. That was one thing he would miss about this place. At least he got to ride her one last time. Sir Don took off and the boys followed behind him. Curly, as normal, goofed off as they flew in the empty sky. Many times Sir Don had to instruct the boy to settle down. It was a ride that seemed to last a long while to Peter, but when the castle of Terranil came in sight he forgot about the dragging of time. The castle was massive, and it was the centerpiece of the island. Houses and mountains lined the castle, but it was like they weren't even there, sitting next to such a shining masterpiece. The group got a bit closer to the castle until they were by the entrance. Once there, they landed on the ground. Waiting for them was King Atmos himself. He was dressed in grand apparel and wore a crown with a design of a Pegasus. He appeared to be middle-aged, but he had been alive for more than 100 years. If elves were lucky and no sickness or injury happened to them, then they could live up to 1,000 years. The aging process slowed down once they turned 14, otherwise, they aged like a regular person up until then. Unluckily for elves, their immune systems weren't all that great, so none ever lived for more than around 500 years. The good thing about that was generally they never experienced old age. Welcome to Terranil, my young lads. I hope we can find your place here in the kingdom. All of you shall be tested, but like always, I figure many of you wish to become knights. King Atmos said to them. All the boys raised their hands, though they knew they wouldn't get picked compared to those like Nibs, Slightly, and Peter. The king laughed and clapped his hands. It was the response he got every time without fail. Then I'm sure you all know we accept only 2. And those 2 will be granted a title of nobility. Now let's get started. First, you are going to start by making the queen lunch.